Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. So I want you to imagine staring at a city of nearly 2 million people.
Right, which is just a staggering number for that time.
Yeah, exactly. It's the undisputed beating heart of the global economy, packed with, unimaginable wealth. But it's also harboring these incredibly dark, dangerous, disease-ridden slums.
Some of the worst on Earth, honestly.
Oh, without a doubt. And the government's infrastructure has just completely failed to keep up with the population explosion. The established churches are, well, they're basically paralyzed by their own bureaucracy.
And class divides, too. Massive class divides.
Right. So your solution to this absolute nightmare is to meet two friends in a tiny cottage at 6 a.m. and just casually declare, hey, we're going to fix this ourselves.
I mean, it sounds like pure arrogance, right? Or just profound naivete. But the crazy thing is, they actually did it.
They really did.
Yeah, and that's what we're exploring in this deep dive today. We're looking at the historical blueprint of that exact intervention.
And we're using a really fascinating source for this, right?
We are. It's a text from 1884 called These 50 Years, being the Jubilee Volume of the London City Mission. It was written by John Matthias Weylland, with an introduction by the Earl of Shaftesbury.
A huge name at the time.
Huge! And our whole mission today is to sort of dissect the actual mechanics of how this tiny, fiercely dedicated group just bypassed every traditional power structure.
Right, they just went around them entirely.
Exactly. They built this massive, non-denominational movement called the London City Mission, and their big, radical innovation was using unordained lay workers.
Just ordinary guys.
Yeah, ordinary tradesmen. And they literally walk straight into the most neglected, violent corners of the 19th century world.
Okay, let's unpack this impossible problem they were facing, because I really want to set the stage for you, the listener. The sheer scale of London in 1835 is so hard to grasp today.
It really is. We think of modern London with its, sprawling suburbs and the underground.
But back then, it was just a pressure cooker.
Yeah.
2 million souls, basically no suburbs to speak of.
Everyone was just crammed together.
Yeah, the wealthy had these isolated little pockets of luxury, but the working classes, the criminal underground, they were packed into a really tight central geographical area.
It was a city of intense paradox.
Totally. You've got the wealth of the British Empire flowing through the docks, and literally down the street, you have thousands of people who are quite literally starving to death in the dark.
And, in the dark is such an apt way to describe it, both literally and figuratively. The source material paints this picture of a population entirely isolated from any kind of moral or social uplift.
Because the traditional systems were broken.
Completely broken. We have to understand that the Industrial Revolution brought this rapid urbanization, and it just shattered the traditional parish system.
Right, because historically, your local church was the community center. The vicar knows everyone, gives out charity.
Exactly. But when hundreds of thousands of desperate people flood the city for work, that system just collapses under the weight. The Church of England was fundamentally failing to reach the masses.
And the charities that did exist, they weren't doing much better.
Not at all. Contemporaries describe their efforts as feeble visits.
Feeble visits. I love that term. Well, I don't love what it represents, but it's so descriptive. It basically meant a wealthy clergyman would stroll down a slightly less dangerous street, hand out a pamphlet, and then run back to his safe rectory.
Precisely. They were functioning, sort of, but paralyzed by their own rigid boundaries. And frankly, they were terrified of the working classes.
They didn't even know how to talk to them.
Right. And they certainly didn't want to go anywhere near the actual slums.
So right into the middle of this total systemic failure walks this guy, David Naismith. And Naismith is not some untested idealist.
No, he's a seasoned organizer.
Exactly. He had already formed a really successful city mission in Glasgow and done similar work in Dublin. So he shows up in London with a proven track record.
But he gets hit with a wall of extreme skepticism.
Oh, massive hostility. He pitches his idea to the religious leaders for what they called a promiscuous body of mixed denominations. And they just flat out tell him he's entirely wrong.
They guaranteed it would fail because it didn't have traditional congregational ties. And we really need to pause and define that phrase, promiscuous body.
Yeah, because it sounds wild to modern ears.
It does. Today, the word carries a very different connotation. But in the 1830s, in this context, it meant an unregulated, highly inappropriate mixing of distinct social or religious categories.
Because Naismith wanted churchmen like loyalists to the state-sponsored Church of England
To sit on the exact same committee with equal voting power alongside dissenters or nonconformists.
which, for you listening, would be groups like the Methodists, the Baptists, the Congregationalists.
Exactly. And to get why this was so scandalous, you have to remember the Church of England wasn't just a church, it was a pillar of the British state.
Right, the politics were heavily intertwined.
Very heavily. Nonconformists had been legally barred from public office for a long time. The restrictions were only just starting to lift, so there was this deep, bitter historical animosity.
So telling an Anglican bishop to collaborate equally with a Methodist tradesman, that's like asking a CEO to give half his board seats to an uncredentialed rival.
It was unthinkable. They were deeply entrenched in their theological silos.
Wait, I need to stop you there because trying to force rival factions to work together, especially 19th century theological rivals, sounds like an absolute bureaucratic nightmare.
It does, yeah.
How did they survive that internal friction? You can't just put people who despise each other's theology in a room and expect them to magically coordinate complex urban logistics.
Well, that's the brilliance of their founding DNA. They survived by creating a really strict, non-negotiable methodology. They agreed to focus 100% of their energy on the ruined and dangerous condition of the poor.
So they just tabled the theology.
Completely. They made a binding pact to leave church building and doctrinal debates out of the boardroom. If someone started arguing about baptism, they were immediately redirected to the fact that children were starving in the cellars of Seven Dials.
Wow. The human suffering was just so immediate, it became the unifying force.
Exactly. They gave themselves no time to argue because the crisis was right outside the door.
And that urgency led to this very specific morning. May 16th, 1835, it's 6:00 a.m.
Early start.
Very early.
Yeah.
They're in this cramped little cottage at 13 Canning Terrace. It's David Naismith, Richard Edward Deere, and William Bullock. There was supposed to be a fourth guy, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but he literally got lost in the London fog and couldn't find the cottage. So it's just these three guys. They meet, they pray, and they officially launch the London City Mission.
The audacity is just breathtaking. 3 guys at dawn taking on the worst urban crisis on the planet.
But what makes that meeting matter isn't just their optimism. It's the strategy they came up with. They didn't decide to just build a shinier church in a poor neighborhood.
No, they came up with something entirely new. The Earl of Shaftesbury describes it as gentle violence.
Gentle violence. That is such an evocative phrase. It implies this total disruption of the status quo, but driven by absolute empathy.
Let's dig into the mechanics of that. The strategy was called domiciliary visitation.
Right, because the old model was passive. You build a grand church, ring the bells, and wait for the poor to show up.
But they were never going to show up. They didn't have Sunday clothes, they smelled like factories, and they felt judged by the wealthy parishioner.
They felt totally alienated, so the mission flips the script. Instead of inviting the poor into wealthy spaces, they sent men of the exact same social class directly into the living spaces of the poor.
This was the critical pivot. Using lay workers, they recruited working-class men, tradesmen who understood the dialect and the harsh realities of the slums.
And the logistics were intense. They divided areas into workable districts of about 500 families,
And assigned 1 missionary to each district.
with an uncompromising mandate. He had to physically visit every single room in every single house and introduce himself.
Every single room. And we have to be clear about what a house meant in a London slum back then.
Oh, yeah. These were vertical slums, old Georgian houses chopped up into pieces.
You'd have 10 or 15 families in one crumbling building.
A family of 6 living in an unlit cellar with a cesspool seeping through the walls, another family on the ground floor, all the way up to the attic where the roof is leaking.
And this lay missionary had to knock on every single door, uninvited, and walk in.
That's why Shaftesbury calls it gentle violence. It was an aggressive intrusion of care. They forced people to engage by bringing the help directly into their private misery.
They didn't wait for an invitation because it was never coming. And because the missionary looked and sounded like them, he bypassed that wall of class resentment.
If an Oxford-educated vicar walked in, he'd be seen as a tax collector or a tourist.
But the lay missionary was a peer. He listened to their problems on their own terms.
There's this one moment in the sources that perfectly captures this. A missionary climbs down into this dark, horrendous-smelling cellar, and sitting there is a chimney sweep.
And sweeps were at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy.
The bottom. deformed from the work, covered in soot, totally ostracized. The missionary walks in and speaks to him with dignity, and the sweep is just paralyzed with shock.
I remember this quote.
Yeah, he says, "Coming to make us religious, well, never down here. We be God and man forsaken." Who would have thought it?
God and man forsaken. It's devastating. It completely captures the psychological reality of the London underclass. They believed they were erased from humanity.
So just having someone physically enter that room was a radical, paradigm-shifting event.
But, this room-by-room strategy quickly uncovered a massive secondary crisis.
Right, because you can't just say a kind word and leave.
Exactly. They realized the deprivation wasn't just economic. These people had absolutely no moral instruction or literature, nothing to read, nothing to anchor them.
Which forces the mission into their first massive logistical operation, the Great Bible Effort.
A triumph of 19th century logistics, honestly. This is before modern census data or digital mapping.
They had to manually map the entire city. They divided London into 433 granular districts.
With hand-drawn maps and ledgers for each one, the missionaries walked the streets, physically counting every poor family that lacked a Bible.
And by their third year, they pulled off something staggering. They distributed Bibles to 35,393 destitute families.
Nearly 36,000 households.
It was such a massive event that the missionaries became known in the slums as the men with the book.
They became a trusted brand in neighborhoods where even the police were afraid to walk.
But of course, massive grassroots success triggers institutional backlash.
It always does. The establishment realized these uncredentialed laymen were organizing the city better than the government. And on New Year's Day, 1839, the hammer fell.
The Bishop of London formally opposed them.
He argued the mission was unauthorized and not under clergy control.
Right. And I want to push back on the timeline here, because that sounds like a death sentence. The bishop's word is law for half the donors in the city. If he cuts off your funding, how do you not collapse?
What's fascinating here is the bishop's real motivation. It wasn't just theological jealousy. You have to look at the political lens of the late 1830s. The British elite were terrified.
Haunted by the French Revolution, right?
Exactly. And domestically, the Chartist movement was brewing a massive working-class push for rights. The elite genuinely believed that letting unsupervised laymen organize the masses was a threat to the social order.
They thought they were spreading socialist or revolutionary ideas disguised as Bible distribution.
They looked at this network of 500 family blocks and saw an insurgency.
So it's political terror masquerading as theology.
Yeah.
But how do they survive the blockade?
Through extreme discipline neutrality. Their natural instinct would be to fight back, launch a PR war. But the mission flatly refused.
They just stayed impartial.
They didn't attack the bishop. They kept their heads down and kept handing out Bibles.
It's the ultimate kill them with kindness strategy. And it proved their agenda was purely humanitarian.
And because they stayed in the trenches, they earned an unprecedented level of trust from the most dangerous element of society, the criminal underworld.
Right, which leads us to the physical geography of crime in the 1830s. The missionaries started gaining access to common lodging houses and criminal rookeries.
These were basically no-go zones.
Yeah, for the listener, a rookery isn't just a bad neighborhood. It was an architectural fortress of crime. Massive blocks of hollowed-out houses connected by secret doors and rooftop walkways.
The police wouldn't go in because they'd be ambushed.
It was a sovereign state of criminality, but the lay missionaries walked right in.
They walked in, and they stayed. This is where we have to talk about Thomas Jackson.
The thieves missionary.
Yes, he didn't just drop off a tract. He spent years sitting in these rookeries, sharing meals, and building genuine relationships with career criminals. He proved he wasn't a police informant.
And his influence leads to this moment that sounds like a Charles Dickens novel, but it's documented history. 40 thieves actually write a round-robin letter to Lord Ashley.
A round robin being a petition signed in a circle so no one looks like the ringleader.
Right. They send this to a powerful aristocrat asking for a meeting to find a way out of a life of crime.
Just think about the sociological weight of that. 40 hardened criminals initiating contact with a nobleman, mediated by a working-class missionary.
It completely subverts the social hierarchy. And Lord Ashley actually accepts. He and Jackson walk into a room packed with 400 criminals.
The contrast in that room must have been incredible. The swell mob in black coats, the high-end con men sitting next to half-dressed savages.
And they didn't demand a ransom. They demanded an exit strategy. They were miserable. But they told Lord Ashley the brutal truth. With a criminal record, no honest employer would hire them.
They were diagnosing their own structural trap.
And the mission actually facilitated a real solution.
They did. That meeting catalyzed organized emigration efforts. They secured funding to send many of these men to the colonies for a fresh start.
It's an incredible victory. But as they're pulling adult thieves out of the rookeries, they're facing an even darker reality with the children.
The environmental conditioning for misery began at birth. The historical records are just harrowing. Thousands of feral children roaming the streets, shoeless, digging for scraps.
There's a mention of a murder room in Seven Dials where kids lived surrounded by constant lethal violence.
It's almost too dark to imagine.
There's one specific anecdote in the sources that just stops you in your tracks. A 6-year-old and a 10-year-old girl. Their alcoholic mother locked them in a filthy room to go drink.
Completely neglected and terrified.
Yeah. And the 6-year-old tried to light a fire to stay warm, and she ended up setting herself on fire.
Horrifying.
But the mission recorded it to show that these kids weren't making bad moral choices. They were trapped in a brutal survival scenario.
Which forced the mission to evolve again. You can't hand a Bible to a starving, burning child. You need physical intervention. And this led directly to the ragged schools.
Okay, explain the mechanics of a ragged school, because education wasn't free back then. How do you educate feral, starving kids?
That's why ragged schools were revolutionary. They were free, makeshift centers set up directly inside the slums. Abandoned warehouses, stables.
It'd pull the kids out of the mud and bring them inside.
Exactly. The curriculum was just the basics: reading, writing, shoemaking. But mostly, it was a physically safe, warm space. Lord Ashley used the missionaries' harrowing stories to leverage philanthropic funding for them.
They realized they had to go upstream. They're pulling people out of the river, but they needed to stop whoever was throwing them in.
And they quickly identified the main engine of that environment, the public house.
The gin bars. Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the mission transitions from a spiritual agency to an urban reform force. There were 10,000 gin bars in London.
And we have to understand why they were central. In a freezing, damp slum, the pub is the only place with a fire, gas lights, and community.
But it was predatory. So the missionaries started physically walking into these 10,000 rowdy, gin-soaked tap rooms to talk about temperance.
The nerve that takes is astounding. They faced incredible hostility.
But then they make this brilliant analytical leap. Preaching temperance is mathematically impossible because the poor literally had no access to clean drinking water.
Right. If you were thirsty, you drank beer, gin, or water from a street pump that was probably drawing from a sewage-tainted water table.
Drinking water meant risking cholera. It's a rigged game. Yeah. So a wealthy MP offers them funding to tackle the alcohol problem, and what do?
They don't print more tracts.
Nope.
They look at the root infrastructural cause. They battle corrupt local vestries for land, and they found the Metropolitan Drinking Fountain and Cattle Trough Association.
They built actual civic plumbing, free, safe drinking water.
It shows that a moral mission will inevitably cross over into public health and civil engineering if you actually listen to the people on the ground.
They did more for temperance by building a fountain than 1,000 sermons ever could. And I want to highlight that adaptability because London was becoming hyper-cosmopolitan.
The empire was expanding.
Yeah, and the mission had to look eastward to the docks. 50,000 foreign seamen arriving every year.
And the conditions were catastrophic. The sources mention Lascar's Asian sailors from the Indian subcontinent found frozen to death in the gutters.
Because of the weather, sure, but also because of a highly organized system of exploitation. The crimps. Tell the listener about the crimping system, because it's basically human trafficking.
Crimps were predatory agents. They'd wait at the docks, lure a sailor to a boarding house, confiscate his discharge papers and wages, and ply him with alcohol.
And suddenly the sailor owes a massive debt.
Exactly. Then the crimp sells the sailor's labor to an outbound ship to pay off the debt, pocketing a fee. Absolute debt bondage.
So the mission realizes their English-speaking guys can't handle this. They appoint specialized missionaries who actually learn the languages.
Meeting the men in their own tongue broke the isolation.
And it scales up into another massive project.
The Strangers' Home for Asiatics, Africans, and South Sea Islanders, a massive, safe boarding house to protect them from crimps. And in 1856, Prince Albert laid the foundation stone.
Just think about that.
Yeah.
20 years earlier, the elite called them a threat to the nation. Now, the Queen husband is endorsing their human rights project.
Because they just relentlessly filled the gaps in the social safety net.
And they had a similar realization about women. You can have the most empathetic male missionary, but a destitute woman isn't going to talk to him about maternal health or hygiene.
It was a massive blind spot, which led to the mothers' meetings and eventually Mrs. Ranyard's Missing Link initiative.
The Bible women.
Right. She saw the chain of social support was broken and empowered working-class women to minister to their peers. They taught practical skills, budget cooking, sanitation, alongside emotional support.
And the people they helped were so diverse. We think of the Victorian poor as a monolith, but the sources mention a ruined French professor.
Oh, right. Displaced by the siege of Paris.
Found starving on the streets of London. It shows the poor included refugees and ruined professionals.
Which is why the mission spent 50 years specializing. By their Jubilee in 1884, they had mapped their workforce onto the economic structure of London.
They had missionaries for omnibus men, canal boatmen, even gypsies in Notting Hill.
Let's look at the cabmen. They worked brutal hours. They couldn't attend daytime meetings.
So the mission adapted. They held midnight meetings when shifts ended. Hot food, coffee, and someone to listen.
And they learned how precarious the cabmen's lives were. If a horse died, the family starved.
So the mission helps organize benefit societies, basically early localized insurance and union solidarity. Plus, they built cabin shelters, little heated green huts on the streets so drivers wouldn't freeze or be forced into pubs.
They systematically removed environmental pressure points. And they gained so much respect that they were officially integrated into the state infrastructure.
Allowed directly into police stations to support traumatized officers.
And into the post office, reaching mail sorters and telegraph boys.
This raises an important question, though. Actually, let's frame it for today. Look at what they did. They targeted the foundational gig workers, transit operators, and infrastructure employees.
Stabilizing the very nervous system of the city.
Yes. If the people running the physical infrastructure are supported, the entire metropolis functions better.
It's profoundly systemic.
They went from 3 guys in a freezing cottage to a massive, internationally respected institution.
And the statistics by 1884 are staggering. 460 to 480 full-time missionaries. Millions of visits.
38,000 drunkards reclaimed.
Yeah.
14,000 fallen women rescued. And those aren't just numbers. Those are family trees fundamentally altered.
Generations saved because someone knocked on their door.
It proves that the most overwhelming urban crises can be tackled with dedicated, localized human intervention. But you have to bypass traditional hierarchies and empower ordinary people.
Which brings us to the core lesson for you, the listener.
Exactly. Whether you're managing a team, organizing a community, or just navigating modern urban life, the lesson is the power of proximate empathy. You can't solve a problem from afar.
You can't do it from a boardroom.
You have to walk into the room, face the hostility, and offer practical, localized help.
Just like those 3 men at 6 a.m. who decided their differences didn't matter in the face of human suffering.
They chose the mission over the politics. And that leaves us with a final thought to ponder. The London City Mission succeeded by bypassing the gatekeepers and empowering ordinary people. Today, in our hyper-connected but incredibly lonely cities, who are the lay workers of today?
It's a great question.
Are our civic and tech institutions building the modern equivalent of drinking fountains? Or are they just standing on the outside preaching at the slums? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
We really look forward to exploring the next chapter of history with you soon.